Why does everyone in the Odyssey care so much about hospitality? Why does Odysseus reveal his name to the Cyclops when staying silent would have saved him? And why can Penelope simply not refuse the suitors outright? To modern readers, many of the poem's decisions can seem strange. But once you understand the world Homer was writing for, they begin to make perfect sense. The Odyssey comes out of the Archaic period of ancient Greece, composed and refined orally for generations before it was ever written down, sometime around the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era. That's centuries after the events it describes are set, if those events happened at all. The poem imagines a heroic, half-remembered past, the way a modern story might romanticize a distant historical era. It was composed for performance, not silent reading. Audiences heard it recited aloud, often over multiple sittings, by a professional singer accompanying himself on a stringed instrument. That performance context explains a lot about how the poem is built. The repeated descriptive phrases attached to characters, cunning Odysseus or wise Penelope, aren't lazy writing. They're memory aids for both the performer and the listening audience, markers that helped an oral audience track a sprawling cast without a text in front of them to flip back through. The same is true of the poem's non-chronological structure, opening in Ithaca with Telemachus, then doubling back to let Odysseus narrate his own 10 years of wandering as a story within the story. That structure works beautifully for a live audience, who can be told directly, through a character's own voice, what happened off stage, rather than needing a narrator to jump around in time. It's worth remembering, too, that ancient audiences for this poem were living in a world of small, competing city-states scattered around the Aegean and Mediterranean coastlines, with sea travel as the fastest and often only way to move between them. The scattered, island-hopping geography of Odysseus's journey wasn't fantastical to that audience the way it can feel today. It mirrored the real hazards, the real uncertainty, and the real dependence on hospitality from strangers that came with any sea voyage in their own lived experience. The single most important piece of social context for understanding this poem is xenia, the Greek concept of hospitality toward guests and strangers. In this world, xenia isn't just good manners. It's close to a sacred law, enforced by Zeus himself in his role as protector of travelers. A host was expected to feed, shelter, and even give gifts to a stranger arriving at their door, before even asking that stranger's name. In return, guests were expected to behave respectfully and not overstay their welcome or abuse the host's generosity. This matters because the entire moral architecture of the Odyssey runs on xenia being honored or broken. When Telemachus travels to Pylos and Sparta, he's treated exactly as the custom demands, fed and honored before anyone asks his business. When Odysseus washes up on Scheria, King Alcinous extends full hospitality to a stranger he knows nothing about, and it's treated as exactly the right way to behave. The suitors back in Ithaca are the poem's clearest villains precisely because they invert xenia. They are guests who have overstayed catastrophically, consuming their host's wealth for years, refusing to leave, and treating a household that isn't theirs as though it belongs to them. An ancient audience wouldn't need to be told the suitors are in the wrong. The scale of their hospitality violation would have made that obvious immediately. Xenia carried real practical weight in a world without hotels, reliable maps, or safe travel guarantees. A traveler's survival genuinely depended on strangers honoring this code, and a host's reputation depended just as heavily on being seen to honor it in return. That mutual dependency is why the poem treats good and bad hosting as close to a moral test of a person's entire character, not a minor social nicety. Even the monstrous Cyclops Polyphemus is measured against this standard, and found monstrous partly because of it. Instead of feeding and sheltering the strangers who arrive at his cave, he eats them, the single most extreme possible inversion of the guest-host relationship the poem can imagine. Alongside Xenia sits a warrior culture built around kleos, or glory, the kind of lasting fame that gets you remembered in song after you're dead. This is the value system Odysseus fought under at Troy, and it explains behavior in the Odyssey that can look reckless to a modern reader. When Odysseus shouts his real name back at the blinded Cyclops Polyphemus, he isn't just being careless. He's acting on a value system where claiming credit for a triumph, being known as the man who did this, matters as much as the safety of escaping quietly. That instinct toward glory clashes throughout the poem with a different value, one closer to endurance and self-control, patience, disguise, and the willingness to absorb insults without immediate retaliation. Watching Odysseus struggle between these two impulses, the urge to declare himself and the discipline to wait, is one of the poem's central tensions, and it's rooted directly in the competing values of the culture that produced it. The third piece of context is the household, or oikos, and the enormous pressure placed on the people running it in a man's prolonged absence. In this society, a king's household wasn't just his family. It was a political and economic unit. Land, livestock, servants, and a claim to rule that could be inherited or, under the right circumstances, contested. Penelope's situation only makes sense against this backdrop. She isn't simply a woman missing her husband. She is the sole authority holding together a kingdom's wealth and succession, while dozens of ambitious men circle, each hoping to marry her and absorb Odysseus's estate and title along with her. Her weaving trick isn't a charming personality quirk. It's a serious political stalling tactic, deployed by someone with genuinely limited options in a system that gave women little formal power, but plenty of informal influence through exactly this kind of resourcefulness. Telemachus faces a mirrored pressure from the other direction. As Odysseus's only son, he's expected to be ready to defend or inherit the household himself, and his slow, uncertain growth across the poem reflects real anxiety in this culture about whether the next generation can hold what the previous one built. It's also worth being honest about how this society structured status within the household, since it shapes several relationships in the poem that can otherwise look confusing to a modern viewer. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people were an ordinary part of an archaic Greek estate, and characters like Eumaeus the swineherd and Eurycleia, the nurse, occupy exactly that position. Bound to the household, yet capable of deep personal loyalty and even quiet moral authority within it, as shown by how instrumental both of them become to Odysseus's eventual return. Women's formal power in this society was similarly limited by law and custom, largely excluded from public political life, which makes Penelope's sustained influence over Ithaca's fate achieved almost entirely through patience, misdirection, and social skill, rather than any formal authority. A genuinely striking feature of the poem rather than a simple background detail. It's also worth understanding how differently this society thought about fate and the gods compared to most modern worldviews. The gods in the Odyssey aren't distant abstractions. They intervene constantly and personally, disguising themselves, nudging events, punishing insults to their honor. Yet the poem doesn't treat humans as pure puppets, either. Early on, Zeus specifically complains that mortals blame the gods for troubles that are actually their own fault, and the poem backs him up. Polyphemus is blinded because of his own cruelty, and Odysseus's men die specifically because they ignore direct warnings and eat the sun god's cattle anyway. Divine will and personal responsibility operate side by side in this worldview, not as a contradiction, but as two forces acting on the same events. Individual gods also have their own personalities, grudges, and favorites, rather than acting as a single unified moral authority, which is why Odysseus can be simultaneously protected by Athena and hunted by Poseidon across the very same journey. The gods in this world behave less like an impersonal cosmic order and more like an extended, quarrelsome family whose personal disputes regularly spill over into human affairs. Put all three of these pieces together, and a lot of the poem's plot decisions stop looking arbitrary. The suitors die not simply because they're the obstacle to a happy ending, but because they've committed a severe and prolonged violation of a sacred social law. Odysseus's slow, careful return in disguise reflects a hard-won shift away from glory-seeking impulsiveness toward patience. And Penelope's 20 years of quiet strategy make sense as the actions of someone managing a fragile household under real political threat, not simply as a woman passively waiting. None of this requires abandoning the poem's monsters and magic. It just means reading the human relationships underneath them with the social rules of their own world in mind, rather than modern assumptions about hospitality, honor, or marriage.